Hello, my name is Joann Lee with the Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles, and I will be providing this short tech talk on machine translation. Is it really here or not? I want to start by taking a step back and looking at language rights and the concept of language justice in a broader context. We know that language rights can be viewed in the context of traditional civil rights mandates that cover national origin discrimination, which includes language. Also included are rights to have meaningful access to public benefits and services, as well as civic participation through interpreting, translation services, and bilingual staff. Many of us in legal services have advocated for these rights for our clients in the past. There are also other aspects of language rights and language justice that have to do with building and preserving communities, like the right to maintain non-dominant languages and pass them to future generations, and the right for everyone's language to be valued and respected, and not just thinking about how to accommodate language needs as an afterthought. I think it's important to use this lens, especially now with the heightened racial justice movement, as linguistically marginalized communities are largely people of color. And these populations and their needs can change rapidly, as we can see now, for example, with individuals from the Afghan and Haitian communities coming to the US. By talking about it in this way, we can see that there are complex layers and intersections of identities and oppression present in different contexts. We want to promote language rights in a way that seeks to guarantee the full exercise of fundamental rights for all individuals and communities, and ensure that these equitable multilingual spaces are seen as essential for building strong movements for racial and social justice. Many of you may be familiar with Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits federally funded entities from discriminating on the basis of race, color, or national origin. I won't spend too much time on this, but wanted to point out that various agencies, including LSC, have guidance documents and regulations that provide more details on language access mandates and how they should be implemented and enforced. The provision of meaningful language access, as required by Title VI and other statutes, includes many components, but today I'm going to focus on the provision of written translation of vital information and materials. And in this context, it's important to note that federal agencies have rejected machine translation as a method of complying with Title VI and other mandates. As you can see here, in various letters, presentations, and even in a recent enforcement agreement, federal agencies have indicated that machine translation without qualified human review does not constitute meaningful language access. So even though we have legal mandates and awareness around language rights, we still have a lot of language oppression and trauma with language rights not being protected. There have been so many examples of individuals who've been unable to access critical services and benefits due to language barriers. During the pandemic, information, updates, and application portals for benefits and services went remote, limiting access for our clients in many ways, exposing and exacerbating a wide range of language barriers for our client communities. The advancements in technology during the pandemic were great for those who could navigate remote spaces in English, but left behind many, especially those in our linguistically marginalized communities. Many of these online resources and portals were not professionally translated, but rather they relied on free programs such as Google Translate to provide language services. So let's take a closer look at machine translation. First, a note on terminology. Translation is used to describe written communication that conveys the meaning of text from one language to another. It is not the automatic conversion of words from one language to another. Rather, the translator identifies the meaning of what is written in the source language and finds the most appropriate equivalent in the target language. The importance of conveying meaning instead of translating words is especially crucial in the legal setting, because non-English languages often lack direct translations of the words used in the US legal system. Terms that may seem common to us, like domestic violence, can be challenging to translate depending on the language, and it is important to have qualified human translators who understand our work to provide such translations. It's also important to understand that not everyone can translate. Translators must be qualified based on whether they have the proper knowledge in both languages, education and training, writing skills, experience, and familiarity with the subject matter. Some may actually have certain accreditations from various entities like the American Translators Association or the courts. So what is machine translation? It is automated software that translates written information without human review. Machine translation is based on probability. It detects patterns in hundreds of millions of translated documents and tries to make logical guesses. Some programs learn and adjust based on feedback. There is no understanding of meaning or context. You must be able to read and comprehend both languages to know if the translation is accurate. It's also important to note that some professional translators do use machine translation appropriately as a first step, as a starting point, and then go on to perform significant human review to ensure accuracy. Take a look at the American Translators Association website. It has this image that analogizes machine translation with Alexa. Just as Alexa can answer simple questions but can't think for you, machine translation may get the gist but can't convey complex thoughts. I'm sure many of you have had the experience where sometimes Alexa gives you something completely out of context or nonsensical. There are times when you may be able to use machine translation, such as if you're ordering at a restaurant in another country, or perhaps trying to communicate with someone in a friendly conversation. These tools may be adequate for an audience who's going to recognize the errors of syntax based on a high level of education and literacy, but they are generally clunky and compromise meaning in many situations. Here is an important example. During the pandemic, the Virginia Department of Health used Google Translate to inform the public that the vaccine was not required, but it was translated into the vaccine is not necessary. This caused a great deal of confusion and mistrust in the community during a time where accurate information was, and still is, literally a matter of life and death. Now let's look at the courts. During a traffic stop, a Kansas Highway Patrol officer stopped a driver who had suspended registration. The officer used Google Translate on his laptop to communicate and typed, "Can I search the car?" Here's what was shown to the driver as a Spanish translation of the question. After some back and forth indicating a lack of understanding, the driver said, "Sure, okay, yeah." The car was searched and drugs were uncovered. The defendant filed a motion to suppress the evidence on the grounds that his consent was not freely given with full understanding because of the language barrier and the use of Google Translate, which generated an unclear translation. As you can see here, the back translation shows a different meaning, as buscar does not mean search in the way the officer intended, but is actually to search for or to look for. Without his consent, the defendant argued that the search was illegal. The court agreed and ordered the defendant's motion to suppress be granted. Now, we have done some testing with different machine translation apps and portals and examined the impact on our community. Not only does it produce inaccurate and confusing translations, which could be very dangerous, another major concern is that there is a complete failure to center the needs of our community members who may have limited access to formal education, they may have low literacy, and they may have limited experience and or access with and to technology. There are also issues with how some languages default to the masculine form of gendered words that refer to people. For example, people who use she, her, or they, them pronouns are automatically referred to as he, him in many Spanish translations. For transgender women, this could be deeply offensive and could deter an applicant from continuing to seek services from the agency based on a belief that the agency is not a safe, affirming, or respectful environment for transgender community members. There are also issues around the use of register, formal versus informal phrasing, which is very important in many languages, although not as much in English. There are also issues around overall tone. The wrong register and tone can be very offensive and hurtful to our diverse communities, some of whom are already mistrustful of us and have been underserved due to historical language barriers. Many of our clients are survivors of trauma, harassment, abuse, and violence, and using a disrespectful tone or register could re-traumatize them, as we may be using language that was used by their abusers or perpetrators. These clients and applicants deserve to be treated with dignity and respect as they take the brave step of seeking assistance. Allowing such errors in communication goes against the client-centered and trauma-informed approaches our organizations, as well as government agencies, should promote in order to reach and serve the most vulnerable in our communities. So how do we produce quality translations? I won't go through all of these, but will highlight the first and last points. The first step is to commit resources to using qualified human translators. This includes funding and planning. This is an important point because allocating funding, time, and energy to provide meaningful language services should be like other things that we prioritize, like electricity, technology, equipment. It's a cost of doing business and should be prioritized as an essential need. If it's not feasible to provide a written translation, use a qualified interpreter to provide a thorough site translation and allow the individual to ask follow-up questions. You can also explain the document in plain language with a qualified interpreter. It's also important to note that interpreters should not be asked to explain or summarize a document on their own because they lack the legal training to decide which parts to highlight. Finally, I wanted to provide some examples of jurisdictions that have provided quality translations without relying solely on machines. Oregon, which has a relatively small population of individuals with limited English proficiency, less than 300,000, has 15 languages other than English on their unemployment insurance website. Last year, the California Department of Social Services contracted with many nonprofit organizations to administer a disaster relief program for immigrants, and they had FAQs in 17 languages on their website prior to rollout. Access NYC has information written in 10 languages based on a citywide mandate for all city services. Hawaii is always a good example with many languages on various government websites. We also have the state of Washington, where the governor issued a statewide COVID-19 response language access plan, which required vital information to be in 37 languages, following federal safe harbor guidance that calls for written translations for language groups of 1,000 or more individuals with limited English proficiency. Another common practice has been to explain updated information in language through social media channels such as YouTube and Facebook Live. During the pandemic, some government agencies had almost daily updates on processes and changes to their operations, and some community groups and legal aid organizations use these social media portals as a way to get out information quickly in language. This is also a useful way to supplement complex translated documents and is also effective for language groups that may not have high literacy rates. These examples show that it is possible to provide high quality translations and language services with proper planning. Meaningful access requires a broad and holistic application of different approaches and services. We must take the time and commit resources in a strategic manner to integrate language justice principles in planning for and providing meaningful language services. Thank you.